Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our today's seminar. I'm sure it's going to be of great interest because it's, of course, a very timely topic to listen to. I would like to also give a particular thank you to our today's speaker, Dr. Ian McKinley, who is not enjoying the sun out as we have it here in Tokyo, but it's 4 o'clock in the morning in Switzerland. So thank you very much for joining us at such an untimely time in Switzerland. Thank you very much. With this, I would like to pass on to the introduction by Stefan. Thank you.
So dear members, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our lunch webinar. Thank you for your time to connect and participate today. As today marks the 10th anniversary of the Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, we invited a guest speaker who is specialized in consulting on radioactive waste, contamination, decommissioning, and remediation. I would like to briefly introduce the speaker. Dr. Ian McKinley is a professor and consultant with 35 years of experience in dealing with radioactive material. He's worked for over 4 decades in multidisciplinary science, underpinning radioactive waste management. After studying marine releases of radioactivity in Scotland and supporting the British nuclear waste disposal program, he moved to Switzerland in the mid-80s. In addition to projects for a Swiss repository, he has collaborated intensively with colleagues in Japan for 3 decades, spending time as visiting professor at Nagoya and Okayama universities. After the Fukushima Daiichi accident, his team worked with the Japan Atomic Energy Agency to assess contamination, develop remediation projects, and evaluate long-term options for the 1F reactor site. Ian was born in Scotland and now lives in Switzerland, from where he is also speaking to us this early morning Swiss time. I am pleased that Ian accepted our invitation to talk with us about the accident details, the consequences Japan and the world took away from this event, and what that means for the nuclear future. I would like to mention that you please feel free to send us your questions via the chat function during the presentation or right afterwards. I will then address those on your behalf to Ian. With this, I would like to welcome Ian and hand over for his presentation now.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And thank you to the Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to give this presentation. I would also like to thank my co-author, Susie, who helped me to put together this presentation. So what I want to do today is to look a little bit more into what happened 10 years ago. This was a really awful accident which shocked people around the world. So much of it covered live in television, where we saw, first of all, the impacts of the earthquake, but then the really terrible tsunami that followed. And this really was devastating for the whole Tohoku coast, so that there were direct loss of over 18,000 lives, and it has been ranked as the costliest natural disaster in history. This was 10 years ago, but the impacts are still being suffered. There was the destruction along the coast, but also very intensive pollution due to the destruction of 70 sewage treatment plants and over 3,000 facilities that handle all kinds of potentially toxic chemicals. So this is a long time legacy which will be cleaned up over a long period of time. However, what most people remember and what is covered in the media at the present moment extensively is just one of the incidents associated with this. And these are the reactor core melts at Fukushima Daiichi, locally known as Ichiefu. So what happened. So this was a huge earthquake. I mean, the largest recorded in Japan in a recent history, fourth largest worldwide since 1900. And this caused the reactors to shut down, the 3 reactors at the site which were operational. They shut down as normal, but the earthquake also knocked out power supply to the reactors. This isn't in itself a problem. The problem was the tsunami. And due to the tsunami, there was flooding on site, which knocked out the emergency generators. So these generators supply power to the site in the case of loss of external power. And after these are knocked out, this left only batteries to provide power on site. The key thing about a reactor is that even after it's closed down, there is still a lot of heat produced. So you need to continue cooling it, even when the chain reaction has stopped. So once the batteries ran out of power, they used fire engines to put water in to cool the reactors, but eventually they were not able to continue the cooling. The reactors overheated, and the hot fuel came in contact with water, and this produced hydrogen gas. And the hydrogen gas led to the explosions, which were covered and were so notable in the television coverage. So the thing to recognize is that those were hydrogen explosions, chemical explosions, and they were not explosions of the reactor core itself. As pressure built up in the reactors, it was important that they had to vent these to reduce the risk of damage to the core, to the protection. And during the venting, there was some release of radioactivity. These were mainly isotopes of the elements iodine and cesium. And basically, it was quite lucky, and most of the time, any releases were dispersed over sea, but some of them passed over land. And at any time when it was raining, there was fallout of this radioactivity. Iodine and cesium. Iodine is actually the more problematic radionuclide, and this causes restriction in foodstuffs, evacuation, but it is relatively short-lived. So after a short period of time, the iodine has decayed away, and it's radioactive cesium that dominates. And this has been the challenge after the accident, to clean up the contaminated soil, to clean up the houses, and to make sure that people can safely return to the areas that were evacuated. So the offsite, of course, is the main concern, but the on-site, there has been work since the accident happened. And the key thing to recognize here is that almost all of the radioactivity was contained within the reactors. This, of course, is very good. This means that the releases were minimal, but because of the high radiation on site, then it was important to reduce this as much as possible so that the workers could go in to continue the cooling of the reactors on site, to stabilize structures, and to proceed with trying to manage the concerns on site due to these damaged reactors. And one of the obvious things that you could see if you have looked at recent images of the site is that water has been one of the problems. Water has been leaking into the area around the damaged reactors, so that the volume of water that is circulated to cool the reactors has been increasing, and this water is stored on site. There has been decontamination of the water, but as you see from the lower image, the actual site now looks like a tank farm. And this is water which has been cleaned up to some extent, but still there has been no decision to release this. And this is one of the major concerns on site, is how to continue to manage water. So you might ask yourself, what were we doing there? Why should there be a link between Switzerland and Japan? And actually, Japan and Switzerland have worked together in the radioactive waste field for over 3 decades. Our programs are actually remarkably similar. Although Japan is certainly an island and appears nothing like Switzerland, both countries are mountainous with active tectonics, and we have similar types of radioactive waste to dispose of. We have developed concepts that are very similar. So the Japanese concept and the Swiss concept for disposal of waste is similar. And we have worked together in projects, research projects, and some of these in underground laboratories. There is an image here of the Grimsel laboratory in Switzerland, where we worked together with Japanese colleagues to look at how radioactivity from deep disposal of radioactive waste moves through rock. And I also visited 3 years ago underground research facility in Japan. This is actually at Kamaishi, and this was one of the communities that was particularly badly hit by the tsunami. There's also a strange connection with Scotland. So both myself and my colleague Susie, we are both Scottish. We both work in Switzerland, but there is a tradition of studying radioactivity in Scotland that extends over 4 decades. And it is often forgotten that actually contamination by radiocesium is found all around the world. And the major source was actually testing of nuclear weapons. Peaking in the mid-60s, there were over 500 nuclear weapons tested in the atmosphere. And this distributed radiocesium around the world. And in the profile here, you can see measurement of radiocesium in Loch Lomond, one of the beauty spots of Scotland. But in this lake, if you measure the radiocesium, you can see the cesium, which was bomb fallout from 1963, but also from the Chernobyl accident. So we've been working with Japanese colleagues, and after the accident, I was involved in helping to plan the cleanup and to organize international collaboration. But my colleague Susie, she was actually attached directly to Fukushima. So when many foreigners left Fukushima, she actually went there to join the JEA teams and to take some of the experience that we had from sampling the environment in Scotland and transferring this to our colleagues in Fukushima. And yeah, this is the strange thing, that actually Fukushima is more like Scotland than the Ukraine. There have been many comparisons between Fukushima and Chernobyl, but we really should emphasize that these accidents were completely different. In Chernobyl, the core of the reactor exploded, and this distributed the very, very highly radioactive, very highly dangerous radioactive nuclides into the immediate vicinity. And this is the area round about. It's called the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This is very hazardous. There's been no attempt to clean it up. And that is effectively an exclusion zone for an indefinite period of time, completely different to the evacuation zone around Fukushima, which is being cleaned up and people are already returning. So the area of Fukushima is actually much more like Scotland or Scandinavia. These received radiocesium from Chernobyl at levels which are roughly similar to the levels that you experienced in the immediate area of Fukushima. So that it is not the area round about Chernobyl, which is similar, it's Finland and Sweden, Norway and Scotland, which received similar types of radioactivity, this radiocesium. It's also the case that in Scotland, we received radiocesium much earlier. There was an accident which people have mainly forgotten about, a fire in a reactor in northwest England called Windscale, and this also released radiocesium. Much lower amounts than from Fukushima, but this was also distributed over Western Europe and in particular in Scotland. Another source of radiocesium in Scotland is the fact that in the early days, also in this Windscale site, there was reprocessing of spent fuel to produce material for nuclear weapons. So in the early days, the 60s, 70s, production of plutonium for nuclear weapons was one of the major activities carried out in reactors. And due to this process, there was a lot of waste radioactivity produced. And in those days, a lot of it was simply released into the sea. So that when I was doing my PhD in Scotland in the mid-70s, I was measuring radiocesium in seawater. And the measurements that I made, this is an old curve from my PhD, the levels were roughly the same as you would find in Fukushima. And that was because this reprocessing plant in the northwest of England released as much radiocesium into the sea every year as was released total from Fukushima in the accident. So this is a background that although many people feel that the area of Fukushima is unique, it's very hazardous, there isn't contamination like this elsewhere. In fact, it is not particularly unusual. There have been huge areas of the world have been contaminated to similar or even higher levels decades ago. So we really do understand this type of contamination. We know what the hazards are and we know how to manage it. So the current situation off-site. So cleanup is moving ahead, and I'm sure many of you will have seen television programs showing the people gradually returning to the site as areas are cleaned up. And so part of this reduction in radioactivity is due to the cleanup. And anyone who travels through Fukushima Prefecture will see large piles of black bags or blue bags containing radioactive waste, which are stored up. And so that's the cleanup from the remediation activities, but also radioactive decay and the natural cleanup processes have greatly reduced the radioactivity. So that in Fukushima city, the level of radiation is reduced by a factor of around 20 compared to immediately after the accident. So this reduced down very greatly. And in fact, the levels that are now measured in the Fukushima prefecture, apart from very, very close to the reactor, are very similar to normal levels of radiation that are found in the environment. And for example, there is a map of Switzerland here, and the areas in red are the areas of higher radiation. And this is nothing at all to do with reactors. The reactors in Switzerland are all in the north, all this area of low radiation. It's due to the fact that as you go higher in altitude, the natural radiation background from cosmic radiation increases. Those areas in the southern part of Switzerland are the high areas in the mountain, but there also tend to be areas that have granitic rock. And this rock has got higher radiation than the sedimentary rock that's found in the northern part of Switzerland. So that if you were to go from Tokyo to Zermatt, you would considerably increase your radiation dose. It's not harmful at all, but that is just the difference in natural radiation. You also get an increased radiation dose by air travel. Just because you are flying at a higher altitude, you get a radiation dose. And so the radiation at maximum in Fukushima City was less than the dose limit to aircrew. So if you were a JAL pilot or a Swiss air hostess, then the radiation limit is greater than the radiation exposure in Fukushima City. And then now, if you look at the radiation dose, a return flight from Zurich to Tokyo, that's about the same as the extra dose you would get in 2 months if you move from Tokyo to Fukushima. Or you would get it in 2 weeks if you decided to go for a long holiday in Zermatt. These are not hazardous radiation doses. This is natural radiation, and the main message here is that there is not a direct hazard in terms of external exposure. This is not to say that the area is completely cleaned up, because in some parts, in particular in forests, it's not possible to carry out the cleanup. And there are a few cases where natural organisms concentrate radiocesium. Luckily for cesium, there are very few, but amongst the organisms that concentrate radiocesium are mushrooms, so that there will be restrictions in Fukushima for an extensive period of time in terms of the consumption of mushrooms. But actually, there are also restrictions on consumption of mushrooms in some parts of northern Italy, and this is as a result of the Chernobyl accident. So there are some concerns, but in general, the situation off-site is more or less back to normal. On-site, it's not so positive. There has been a lot of structural stabilization and cleanup, which makes it much easier for people to work on site. But one of the problems I mentioned at the beginning was that water was leaking into the damaged reactors, and managing this water was a problem. They decided to build an ice wall around the reactors to reduce this water. And this really didn't work very well. It's interesting that the cleanup off-site worked very well, but they used very traditional methods. It was mainly washing surfaces, removing surface soil. On-site, they used this rather novel method, and it really didn't work very well. So there still are concerns about water. And there is the concern about how are they going to clean up the damaged reactors, actually decommission them, take the damaged fuel out, move it away for disposal. Here, the Japanese plans are very ambitious. They want to clean up the site within decades. So within about 30 or 40 years to have cleaned up the reactors. And I think that this is actually a little bit ambitious. It's possible. Japan has the technology. They're a very rich country. And in particular, there's been a lot of development of the robotic technology, automated technology that would allow you to do this safely. But if you leave the reactors for a while, because of radioactive decay, it will be easier to decommission them, to take them apart. So it is something that if it is politically possible, for a technical point of view, it would be sensible to postpone the decommissioning on site. And there I could mention, I mentioned that there was an accident in 1957 in England. That reactor has still not been decommissioned. They decided that they would leave it for 80 years before cleaning it up. And that is exactly to allow the radioactivity to decay. It's sealed, there is no leakage of radioactivity from this reactor, but leaving time before you decommission makes the job easier. So that is maybe something that could be considered in the future on site. The accident, of course, has caused a lot of questioning about nuclear power. Is it even acceptable to consider nuclear power when you can have accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima? When you look at it from a technical point of view, it's unlike other major accidents. In fact, there have been accidents, a number of accidents, some of them completely forgotten, some of them over-exaggerated, but the number of deaths from nuclear reactors have been very, very small. The 1957 fire, this was an air-cooled reactor, the reactor core caught fire. There was a release of iodine and radiocesium. But the main problem with this reactor was they were producing an isotope for bombs. And this isotope was also released, it's polonium. It has been used as a poison because it is so radioactive, so dangerous. And statistically, there may have been deaths due to this accident, but almost certainly due to the polonium, not to cesium or iodine. 3 Mile Island was an accident which many people know about, a core melt, but the releases of radioactivity were very, very small. And in terms of radiation, no indication of any deaths or long-term health effects. The one accident that really caused a large health impact from radiation was Chernobyl, because the core exploded. So there were at least 50 deaths to emergency workers. And if anyone has seen the movie recreation of this, you will realize the terrible conditions that these people were working under. Very high doses to 200,000 other people. And there is likely to be early deaths in the thousands. And in the area, again, hundreds of thousands got excess doses, maybe 4,000 extra cancers. Worrying, some of these were children cancers. This is due to radioiodine. And there was a huge fallout. So this was the most serious accident by far, worse than all of the other accidents put together. But even then, the numbers of deaths are not so huge compared to other accidents. There have been, for example, explosions of liquid natural gas, accidents in coal mines, and in particular, failure of large dams. The concern on radiation, a lot of it is the way in which it is handled by the media. There has been no doubt about it. There is sensationalism, and many articles exaggerate the risk of radiation. And you will notice in a lot of the media coverage of 10 years Fukushima, it will start with the tsunami, images of the tsunami, and then talk about evacuation, the problems of return, focusing on the nuclear power plant, forgetting the fact that actually the deaths and a lot of the major problems were caused by the tsunami and impacted the whole of Tohoku, and the reactor itself, the impacts were minor. And there is no doubt about it, the media and some opposition groups have greatly exaggerated the risk. The comparison with Chernobyl, you see all of the time, and it is completely wrong. And so this is misinformation. And I think it's important that the information should be clearer. You should avoid or be very careful of anything which is based on mathematical models. Based on the assumptions that you put into the model, you can calculate anything you like. And a lot of these models predicting hundreds of thousands of deaths are quite frankly nonsensical. The good examples of communication, I have example here of the Ichiefu manga. I mean, I think this is an excellent indication of what the real issues are for workers on site by someone who actually worked on site. And this is the kind of clear communication that we need, not trying to be sensational, but just to use examples to show really what does it mean, a nuclear accident, a meltdown. And there are pundits who have been talking on the television, available on the internet, that say after a meltdown, reactor is contaminated for all time. We can use examples and show that is simply not true. Probably the least known reactor accident actually happened in Lusong in Switzerland. And this was a reactor meltdown. It was an experimental reactor, and this melted down shortly after the reactor was first switched on. This caused no contamination, no significant contamination, because being Switzerland, the reactor was actually built underground. And so the reactor area could be sealed. And after a number of years, it could be completely decommissioned. So all of the reactor components have been removed. They are now stored at the Zwielag interim storage facility near Wurenlingen in Switzerland. And actually the reactor cavern, where the cave that the building used to be in, is now used as an archive, a store by the canton. The radiation levels are completely natural. And so this shows you that complete cleanup is not only possible, it has been done, and actually has been done in Switzerland, but for a much smaller reactor and with much less contamination. So it's important to learn from reactor from accidents. After the reactor accident, it is often easy to see things that could have been done better, which would have avoided the accident. And there is no doubt about it. The accident in Fukushima was not a technological argument, accident. It wasn't a fundamental problem with the technology. It was a problem of manpower. It wasn't planned properly. We can see that now, but at the time it wasn't so obvious. And it is really important that you learn from this. And I have an example there of from the website from ENSI, the nuclear regulator in Switzerland. And I think that they've done an excellent job of learning from Fukushima. Switzerland doesn't have any sea coastline, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't accidents that could cause flooding of a reactor. So NC, the regulator, has looked into these and worked to ensure that even if the cause was different, you couldn't have this kind of blackout accident in Switzerland. So I think they've done it really well. Other countries have not done it so well. In the UK, they simply said this was an accident caused by a tsunami. In the UK, we don't get tsunamis, so we don't have to worry. They are wrong on both counts. You can get tsunamis, even in the UK. They had a tsunami at the end of the last ice age, which hit the east coast of the country. But also, you can have accidents which cause loss of power. So it's important to learn from every accident to make sure it doesn't happen again. But these lessons apply not only to reactors, they apply to all sensitive facilities. We saw the damage to oil storage facilities, to other facilities on the coast, and we should learn to protect those also. We have to think also, if we are worried about nuclear, would there be options that would have less impact? The advantage of nuclear power plants is that they're very small, and when they're operating, they have few direct environmental impacts. Hydropower is the obvious alternative for providing large amounts of dependable power. It is undoubtedly very attractive, but the environmental impacts are large. The Three Gorges Dam, the example that was shown here, that in order to create this power plant, 1,000 square kilometers were flooded and 1.3 million people were displaced. So this is a huge impact on the environment. It was considered to be cost effective, but there are limits to what can be done with hydro. The real problem is with fossil fuels. And I think everybody is now aware that with fossil fuels, climate change, global warming, the worst case would be catastrophic. Currently, we are in a situation where carbon dioxide levels are increasing at a rate that there is no precedent for in the geological record. We have no idea what impact this will have. There are many models that predict a limited impact, but the one thing that we know is that in the worst case, if we lose the ice caps, the impact would be huge. And their figure that's shown there is what would happen if the ice caps would melt. The dramatic thing is that Beijing would be a coastal city. So a huge area of China would be flooded. Tokyo would be underwater, as would Calcutta, Rangoon, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Manila, Ho Chi Minh City. The impacts are gigantic. And people talk about the Fukushima catastrophe. If you really want to use the term catastrophe, that should be used for runaway global warming. Other things are disasters, but true catastrophes are the impacts of fossil fuel. And with that in mind, it is excellent that countries are moving towards carbon neutrality. We have to do this, and we have to do it as rapidly as possible. But for the case of Japan, there is no possibility of doing it without fossil fuel. I think it's very clear all that has happened when they have closed down the reactors. There's been a slight increase in renewable energy, but mainly an increase in fossil fuels. And this we have got to fight against in every way possible. So I think this is a case where there's a simple answer. Japan cannot do without nuclear power, and in fact needs expansion of nuclear power. It is the only way that carbon neutrality can be met. So the final thing is that whenever you talk about nuclear power, the question always comes, what do you do with the waste? You know, that this is claimed to be the unsolved problem. In fact, the lower level radioactive wastes have been disposed of safely for years and are disposed of in Japan in the Rokasho-Mura area for decades, very safe. But the concern is the high radioactive waste, the very highly radioactive waste. The thing about this is that the volumes of it are very small. So a big reactor only produces about 3 cubic meters of high level waste per year. So the volumes are very small. It means that the waste can be stored. And again, storing the waste is good because the radiation decreases and it's easier to dispose of. And the programs are moving ahead, especially Finland and Sweden. They are in the process of licensing repositories, and these will be in operation soon, so that we have the ability, the technical ability to dispose of all of the waste safely. We need acceptance. And the fact that recently in Hokkaido, there have been volunteers who are open to study as potential hosts for a repository show that this is possible. The waste problem is easily solvable. And so I'll finish with the takeaway messages. The earthquake and tsunami, it was a major disaster. These will continue, the impacts will continue for years, decades to come. But please remember the other people from the Tohoku region who are suffering, not just Fukushima Prefecture. There are other prefectures which are badly damaged and will need a lot of support for recovery. The Ichiefu accident, it was serious. It had large economic impacts. It impacted nuclear power around the globe. The impact around the globe was limited in time, but the health consequences greatly exaggerated. Any impact in terms of radiological health risk will be negligible. It will be impossible to determine because of the impacts of natural radiation. The bottom line is that we have to have as a priority phasing out fossil fuel. This is key. In some countries, they may be able to do it entirely with renewables, but with existing technology, this is not possible for Japan. So I think that Japan will need nuclear power, will need to expand nuclear power, and logically, they should even think about how sensible it is to close the undamaged reactors at Ichiefu, at Fukushima Daiichi, and to close the undamaged reactors at Fukushima Daini. These are completely undamaged reactors and are usable. So the thing is to look at the accident with some kind of perspective. It was terrible, but nothing like as serious as it has been portrayed in the media. We need to learn from it and we need to reduce risks in the future, but I think we can do it. And we need to reduce risks from all fossil fuel and to reduce the possible harm that can be done locally, regionally, and especially globally. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop the presentation here.
Thank you very much, Ian. We have received quite a few questions. I would like to pass them on to you. maybe we can try to answer them as brief as possible, then we can add a few more. So the first one came from one of the participants asking about the Onagawa nuclear power plant. And it's also a coastline power plant and quite near to the Fukushima plant. And the question is, how much was it exposed to the tsunami, and how come there was no damage or no such damage to that plant?
Yes, but this is a really good example. The Onagawa plant is much closer to the epicenter of the earthquake. It is a later power plant, and it was designed by the local utility, and they were aware of the risk of tsunamis, and so they raised the power plant. And so the power plant was above the level of maximum tsunami risk. And in fact, some of the associated building around the plant, they were used for local people to evacuate to. So it was a well-planned reactor. A problem with Fukushima Daiichi was that the early reactors were built to US standards. And so the US safety standards, so these are very old reactors, the US safety standards defend against tornadoes, which you don't get in Japan, but they weren't set up to defend against tsunamis. So the reactors in Fukushima were actually lowered to make the pumping of cooling water more efficient. So fundamentally, the Onagawa plant was much better designed in terms of location. And fundamentally, it showed you that with proper planning, the accident is completely preventable. The nuclear power plants are robust.
Okay, that exactly answers another question where someone was asking if the accident would have been preventable by better planning or better worst case scenario forecasting. So thanks for that. Another question is coming here for what is the estimated average cost associated with the Fukushima disaster that has to be paid by Japanese taxpayers over how many years to go? Maybe a very difficult question to answer.
This is a really difficult question. There have been estimates, and so these are all billions of dollars, many billions of dollars. The main problem is it's very unclear what exactly they are going to do with the site. We have looked at some of the cost estimates, and about 85% of the total cost is managing the waste. And this is assuming that all of the waste will be moved off site and disposed somewhere else. Nobody knows where this somewhere else will be, but there are huge uncertain costs. The Chernobyl site is actually now used as a nationwide site for radioactive waste disposal, which is kind of logical because the site is contaminated anyway. If you were to use some lateral thinking, I'm sure that you could reduce the costs of the cleanup on site by at least 50% and maybe 90%. And when you're talking of maybe hundreds of billions of dollars, this is a huge saving. So the fact is that is extremely uncertain at the present moment. It will be expensive, there is no doubt about that, but the expense could be reduced very considerably by planning.
Maybe some of the insurance companies will take a share of that as well, or how do you see that?
Again, I mean, I don't know how that's handled in Switzerland. Often nuclear utilities share risk between them. So rather than having an external insurance company that provides cover, then the utilities share the risk between them. So I'm not sure exactly how that is covered in Japan, but the overall costs of the tsunami, I mentioned before, $300 billion. That's a minimum estimate. It will probably be much more. And some of that will certainly be covered by insurance, but a large part of it will be covered by the government and the taxpayer.
Okay. Another question is, as mentioned, you've been visiting Japan for decades and offering consulting services in various areas. Shortly after the accident, your colleague, Dr. Susie Hardy, was even in Fukushima to support, as he mentioned. I wonder how much the Japanese authorities are open to consultation from external or foreign advisors like you. And the second question is, and who will be your actual counterparts to speak to? Is that like the JAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, or is that maybe TEPCO you're talking to, or is this purely a government body as a counterpart?
Okay, so the first question, the Japanese in general are very open to international collaboration. I've been working very, very closely with Japanese colleagues for many years. If anything, I would say that the Japanese government and TEPCO were too open to international pressure. I mean, I think that for the management of the site, they used advice from international organizations that wasn't as good as the advice they would have received from their own Japanese specialists. But in terms of the off-site cleanup, because there wasn't so much experience in Japan, then the groups were very open to support. I, and together with my colleague Susie, we were working mainly with JAEA because we have worked with them for many years on many projects, but we have many contacts because we've worked for many years. We have many friends, and we have friends throughout JAEA. We have many friends at TEPCO, friends in other research organizations, and even at government level. So the first contacts are actually through personal contact. So we were able to provide assistance. Later, we got contracts and provided funded support. But at the beginning, through the contact network, we were able to help out because it was our friends and colleagues who were impacted in Japan.
I understand. Okay. Thank you. Maybe squeeze one last question, which also I find very interesting. The question is, if the storage of radioactive waste is safe, then why do they need to be built or stored far away from the civilization?
Well, they don't need to be stored far away from civilization. They need to be stored far away from human activity. The waste, you want to show safety for very long periods of time. So usually at least 100,000 years. And so what you don't want is people forgetting that the waste is there and then disturbing it. And this has happened with chemical waste over the years many times. So the decision is to put it deep underground. So this would maybe be 500 meters or 1,000 meters underground. But this is not necessarily remote from people. In some countries like the US or Australia, they can find somewhere that's 100 kilometers away from any community. In Switzerland, as you know, you're never 10 kilometers away from any community. And any repository that is built, there will be people living above it. And the areas that are being investigated in Switzerland, there are villages and towns above the disposal area, so that it will be ensured that the handling of the waste on the surface is safe. But once it's underground, it will be underground where people can live. Japan has got the advantage, being an island, you could have the option of disposal under the sea. So you put tunnels underneath the sea, and so that then you have double protection. It is very deep underground and it's very far away from people, so that someone won't drill a borehole into it in 1,000 years when they've forgotten. But unfortunately in Switzerland, we don't have any ocean. So we will put it underneath where communities are and just make sure that it's deep enough that there is no risk in the future.
Okay, thanks for the answers. And yeah, I think we are coming to an end. It's almost 1 o'clock. I think, yes, all I have left to say is thank you very much, Ian. It's been a very insightful lunch break for us in Japan. And I much appreciate that you provided us a deeper look into the details of the accident and the aftermath. Very interesting to me was also the comparison of different energy sources, which one maybe tends to forget sometimes when you're comparing with nuclear energy. There is no doubt that the discussion about nuclear energy and global warming will remain a red hot topic for many years to come. Well, Ian, it was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much for waking up super early to talk with us. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'd like to thank all the audience for their interest. I hope that it was interesting for you. The Chamber of Commerce has got some background information on their website, but of course, if anyone has questions, they're free to contact me either directly or through the Chamber of Commerce. I'm always happy to provide any input that people would want. So thank you again for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining today and have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.